Study Session 5, International Trade Policy, Introduction. In the previous study session, we explained the basis for and consequences of free trade. Consequently, countries may not allow free trade because it may pose threat to lives and properties and also disallow infant industries to grow. Therefore, a country should have a policy that will control inflow and outflow of goods and services. This policy is called trade policy. In this study session, we will examine these policy instruments and their implications for trade. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Define and use the following terms: tariff, import quota, export subsidies. 2. Justify that tariff and import quota can achieve the same objective. 3. Analyze the loser and gainers from the imposition of tariff and import quota. Trade policy instruments. Tariff. Tariff is the simplest form of trade policy instruments. It simply means a given predetermined tax imposed on imported goods. There are two types of tariff: the ad valorem tariff and specific tariff. When taxes take a fraction of the volume of goods imported, it is called ad valorem tariff. For example, if a good worth $5 million is to be imported from abroad and 5% ad valorem tax is levied on it, the total payment will be 5 million plus 5% of 5 million, which will give us $5.25 million. In the case of specific tariff, there is a fixed charge levied on each unit of goods imported. For example, the US may impose $5 on each barrel of crude oil imported from Nigeria. It means that if the US imports 10,000 barrels of oil, it is going to pay $50,000 specific tax above the producer's price. The difference between the two types is that while ad valorem tariffs are expressed in proportion of the value of imports, specific tariffs are expressed as a fixed amount to be paid for importing a unit of good. In each case, tariffs appear to raise the cost of importing goods to a country. In Nigeria, tariff appears to be the second largest source of revenue for government after crude oil. The share of tariff in non-oil revenue over around 15 to 20% between 1995 and 2005. However, the purpose of imposing tariff is not only to generate revenue for government, but principally to provide protection for sectors producing similar goods that would have been imported from abroad. For instance, Nigeria may impose high tariff on importation of shoes and shoe leathers or automobiles in order to protect shoe and automobile industries from highly competitive imports from, say, Italy, Japan, and Canada. Generally, government uses tariff instruments to generate revenue and to protect infant industries. Analysis of tariff in a single industry. Let us assume that Nigeria and Japan produce the same, say, automobile. In the absence of trade theory tells us that demand for automobile in Nigeria and Japan would depend on their respective domestic prices, and that if prices differ, trade will occur. Now let us assume that relative to domestic price in Nigeria, Japan's domestic price of automobile is lower. Hence, trade theory tells us that Japan will ship automobile to Nigeria. As this process goes on, automobile price in Nigeria will begin to fall, while it will begin to rise in Japan. At a point, there will be a particular price that the two prices will settle. Let us consider this price, say P asterisk, as the equilibrium price of automobile. At the world price, there will be no incentive for automobiles to move from either country. Import demand and export supply curves. The question that follows is, how do we determine equilibrium price and the corresponding equilibrium quantity? To answer this question, we shall define two important curves, namely import demand curve and Japan export supply curve. Nigeria import demand curve is defined as the excess demand for automobile over excess supply of the product. Figure 5.1 shows how Nigeria's import demand curve is determined. The first panel shows how price drives the situation of demand and supply of automobile. For instance, when the price of automobile was P1, consumers were willing to demand for QD1 amount of automobile, but due to low prices, producers were willing to supply just QS1. Thus, the excess demand QD1 minus QS1 is traced at point 1 in the second panel. When price rose from P1 to P2, consumers tend to reduce demand, while producers were willing to increase supply. A look at the graph shows that the reduction in demand is more than offset the increase in supply, thereby generating excess demand. But the present excess demand is not as large as before. Tracing these to panel B will generate point 2. As we continue to increase the price, excess demand continues to fall until a point like 3 is reached where excess demand was 0. Figure 5.1 shows Japan's excess supply curve. At P1, supply was larger than demand, and the excess supply generated was QS1 minus QD1. As price continues to fall, excess supply peters out until it reaches 0 at point 3 in the diagram. Export is determined where Nigeria's import demand is equal to Japan's export supply, and Japan are the only two countries in the world price will. This is depicted in figure 5.3 below. Let us assume Nigeria's demand for automobile be depicted by DN and Nigeria's supply of automobile be SN. Also, let Japan's supply and demand be D1 and S1 respectively. Then from figures 5.1 and 5.2, dn minus sn equals sj minus dj. That's equation 5.1. And then dn plus dj equals sj plus sn, equation 5.2. Since we assume that there are just two countries in the world, then equation 5.2 can be written as dw equals sw. That is, world demand for automobile is equal to world supply of automobile, which is given as equilibrium quantity at the equilibrium price in figure 5.5. Introducing tariff into the analysis. Now consider a specific tariff or ad valorem tariff equivalent, that is $200 on a unit of imported automobile. Producers in Japan will not ship automobile unless the price of automobile in Nigeria is sufficiently high that with this tariff it is profitable to export it. How can the effect of tariff be quantified? let the ad valorem tariff equivalent be $1 per unit. In free trade, the price of automobile will be equalized by PW equals equilibrium price. In the world automobile market, if we now introduce ad valorem tax tariff, Japan will not ship automobile to Nigeria unless the differences between the prices is at least equal to the dollar tax, and this will lead to excess demand in Nigeria. This being the case, price of automobile will rise in Nigeria and fall in Japan. Thus, tariff drives a wedge between the prices in the two markets. As the diagram shows below, tariff raises Nigeria's automobile price by PT and lowers in Japan by P asterisk T, which is equal to PT minus T. The increase in price in Nigeria from PW to PT is less than the amount of tariff and thus is not pushed on Nigerian consumers. This simple example shows an important outcome of trade policy instrument. The size of the effect of tariff on exporters is small. When a small country imposes a tariff on the share of its import in world import, and if its share of import from world import is very small, the effect of tariff will be negligible on world price. Thus, imposing tariff will raise the price of imported products in the country. Imposing the tariff by the full amount of the tariff, production of imported goods will rise, but the demand for it will fall. The gainers and losers in tariff-induced trade. The earlier analysis shows that imposition of tariff raises the price of the good in the importing country and lowers it in the exporting country. From our example, if Nigeria imposes tariff on the importation of automobile, it will raise the price of automobile in Nigeria and lowers it in Japan. Consumers of automobile goods in Nigeria will have to pay more and in the process reduce their purchasing power. The consumers in the exporting country gain because low demand in the importing country led to excess supply in the exporting country, thereby lowering the price. Producers in the importing country gain because they raise the price of their import competing products by the amount of tariff. Though this will lead to reduction in sales, most especially if such imported products are relatively income inelastic. Producers in the exporting country will lose as a result of low price in their countries and low demand in the destination country. Government unambiguously gain by the total amount of tariff. Cost and benefit of tariff. It is possible to quantify the cost and benefit of tariff. Figure 5.5 shows the graphical exposition of how to calculate these. As the graph indicates, domestic prices move from PW to PT as a result of tariff. In the exporting country, the imposition of tariff lowers the foreign export from PW to P star T. As a result, domestic production rises from S1 to S2, and domestic demand contracts from D1 to D2. The regions A, B, C, D, and E measures the cost and benefit. First is the producer surplus, which is measured at the area below the demand curve but above the supply curve. This is labeled A. Domestic consumers face high price and pay more than expected. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above equilibrium price. the price consumers face rises from PW to PT, indicating that consumers' supply falls by the area indicated by A, B, C, D. This implies that consumers in the importing country are seriously off by the tariff. What about the government? The government gained by collecting tariff revenue. The revenue collectible from tariff is still multiplied by the quantity of goods imported. This is calculated by the difference between S2 and D2. The tariff revenue is a rectangle box C plus E, that is PT minus P star T multiplied by D2 minus S2. We'll find out that gains and losers, I take that again, 1, 2. We find out that the gains and losses in a tariff-induced trade are borne by different sets of agents. Producers and government gain, while consumers lose. We cannot say much on the effect of tariff on the overall economy. To be able to do this, we need information about who produces and who consumes. Also, we need information about how government spend tariff revenue. If the rich are the producers of imported products, while the poor are the highest consumer of such products, then tariff will hurt the poor so that they become poorer, and benefit the rich so that they become richer, and this will enlarge the gap between the rich and the poor. Conversely, if the poor are the producer of imported products and the rich are the highest consumer, then tariff will hurt the rich, reducing their purchasing power, and benefit the poor, increasing their purchasing power, and this will contract the gap between the rich and the poor. The former example will worsen the overall welfare of the economy, while the latter will improve it. Also, it is important to understand how government spend this tariff revenue for the provision of needed infrastructure or distributed as constituency shares. Without having these pieces of information, the effect of tariff is fraught with ambiguity. Nevertheless, trade policy analysts attempt to compute the net effect of a tariff on national welfare by assuming that at the margin, a naira worth of gain or loss to each group is of the same worth. Following this assertion, we can compute the net effect of tariff on welfare as follows: producer gain plus government revenue equals consumer loss. That is A plus C plus E bracket minus A plus B plus C plus D all in bracket equals E minus B plus D bracket. B and D are triangles. They measure losses from reduction in production and consumption, and it is called deadweight loss. Thus, the addition of the two is called the efficiency loss. The rectangle A represents the gains accruing to the domestic economy. This is because tariffs lowers foreign export prices relative to domestic prices, indicating an improvement in the terms of trade of the importing country. This E is called trade gain. Note that terms of trade depends on the capacity of the tariff imposing country to drive down foreign export prices. That is, the tariff imposing country must be capable of sufficiently affecting world prices, and the box E disappears so the tariff becomes a welfare reducing instrument. It distorts the incentives of both producers and consumers by forcing them to act as if imports were more expensive than they actually are. A country is said not to be able to affect world price with its tariff if the share of its world output is very small. Such a country is said to be economically small in terms of world market share. This simple analysis shows that while the government of a country may impose tariff as a source of revenue, the country must examine its status in the world market, because failure to do that may result to net welfare loss. Export subsidies. Export subsidy is a payment to a firm or an individual that exports goods to foreign countries. Export subsidy can also be specific or ad valorem. The essence of export subsidy is to lower the cost of export and hence the price of export in the world market. The beneficiaries of export subsidy will export goods up to the point where the difference between domestic price and world price is that amount of subsidy. That is, export will continue as long as P star minus P is greater than 0. The effect of export subsidy on price is exactly the reverse of tariff, except in the case of consumers. The price in the exporting country rises, while the price in the importing country falls. Producers in exporting country gain, consumers are hurt, and government are also losers. Figure 5.6 depicts the scenario clearer. Consumers' loss is the area A plus B. The producer's gain is the area A plus B plus C, while government loss is the area given by B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G. The net welfare loss is producer gain minus consumer loss. Triangles B and D measures the efficiency deadweight loss due to production and consumption distortion. Because export subsidy reduces export prices relative to import prices, it worsens the terms of trade of the subsidy imposing country. This leads to additional terms of trade loss, E plus F plus G, which is equal to PW minus P star S multiplied by QS. Import quota. Import quota is a direct restriction on the quantity of some goods that may be imported. In this case, some groups are issued license to import a certain amount of goods from abroad. Some firms can also be given license to import a certain quantity of goods from abroad. In the case of Nigeria, sugar and cement are some goods that attract import quota. Import quota ambiguously raises the domestic price of imported goods. The difference between a quota and a tariff is that with a quota, the government receives no revenue. When a quota instead of a tariff is used to restrict import, the sum of money that would have appeared as government revenue with a tariff is collected by whoever receives import license. The profit received by the holders of import licenses is called quota rent. To be able to assess the net welfare in this case, we need information about who receives the rent. Summary. In this study session, you learned that trade in the general equilibrium appeared to paint false picture about the gains from trade. In the partial equilibrium, where we consider the presence of trade policy, it was discovered that a small country will lose when it imposes tariff on imports or gives subsidies to promote export. The analysis of a tariff can be adapted to other trade policy instruments such as export subsidy, import quota, and voluntary export restraint. An export subsidy causes efficiency loss similar to tariff but compound these losses by causing a deterioration of the terms of trade. Import quota and voluntary export restraints differs from tariff because the government is not entitled to any revenue. What government would have taken as revenue as accrued to the license owner in forms of rent. This is the end of study session 5. Thanks for listening.